episode of the Bible Toolbox. I'm Luke.
And I'm Chris.
We're here to help you enjoy the tools that scholars and programmers have created for you. And this is another part of our series where we're going through book by book, reviewing the Bible Project. And we are on the Gospel of Luke at this point. So here is my outline of the Bible Project. And they have the same basic three-part outline that we saw in Mark, again, where you have his mission kind of in the northern parts of Galilee. You have the proclamation of Jesus as Messiah by Peter, goes into his Jerusalem journey, or journey towards Jerusalem, and then his final week in Jerusalem. So following a very similar sequence to Mark. And then here's my thesis, and this is actually
They say this.
Basically. Yeah. So the story of Jesus is the fulfillment of the long covenant story of God in Israel, and on a larger scale, the story of God in the whole world.
I like it.
Yeah, it's pretty good. And the other narrative markers. This seems to be what Luke intended.
Structurally, I mean.
Structurally.
Yeah.
So you added I'm going to point out the things I've underlined here. So those three parts, you have Peter declaring, "You're the Christ." Jesus predicts his death right after that, and there's a couple teachings. And then it says in Luke 9:51, when the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem.
That starts the journey narrative.
He's now turned, and his whole mission, his goal is to go to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And then you get in this time these statements of him being on the way. So Luke 13:22, he went on his way to what? Jerusalem, right? Through towns and villages, teaching, journeying toward Jerusalem. And then Luke 17:11, on the way to Jerusalem. So like
he can't stop saying it.
Has his face set to Jerusalem, and then finally in Luke 19:28, when he had said these things, he went on ahead going up into Jerusalem. So that's when this is the triumphal entry, where now Jesus is in Jerusalem. So these like narrative markers seem to be pretty clear of the three-part structure. Luke seems to be the most explicit of the Gospels, and I'm talking about his journey
to Jerusalem. This is the journey part of the story. Yeah. I think it is most clear, and these narrative markers pointed out, the section that's most clear, I think, is this middle section, the journey section, where it's different from their outline of Mark, is in the first section, right? So Luke's introduction is different, longer.
Yep.
They have it as a 2-chapter. I think they do Luke 1 and 2 as intro. Personally, I think I would put Luke 1 through Luke 4, 14 through 15 as all intro, taking 4, 14, 15-ish as the marker of the beginning of his Galilean ministry, so that it's still the same breakdown, roughly. There's still these 3 sections, but they include Luke 3 as part of Jesus and his mission, is that section title. I would call that section Jesus' Galilean ministry. And so that really starts with the Nazareth sermon in Luke 4. And they have a mark here as good news to the poor. I think this moment in Luke 4, when Jesus gives his first sermon by the power of the Spirit, is the official launch of his ministry. I would give this scene pride of place in determining an outline. I think it's critical. And there is this narrative marker that moves in the first half of Luke 4, Jesus is being tempted in the desert by Satan, which in Matthew we said is like a precursor to his ministry. So it's not the start of his public ministry yet. Then you have this clear marker. And when the devil had ended every temptation, he departed from him until an opportune time. So foreshadowing towards something later, and marking a new sort of phase in Jesus' life. And Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit to Galilee, and a report of him went out through all the surrounding country, and he taught in their synagogues, being glorified by all. And then right then we have that first sermon where Jesus reads the Isaiah 61 scroll and faces backlash from people who don't like him. So to me, that's like a critical moment in the narrative, a turning point and the beginning of like a launch of his public ministry.
And something to add to that, like I've noted here, Luke pretty much follows Mark
Mhm.
directly.
Mhm.
The only thing is he omits Mark like half of 6 and into half of 8, so like about 2 chapters or so. And then the one thing is he relocates the Nazareth rejection to the beginning of his ministry
Making
in
it
Luke
sort of
4.
programmatic, making
Yeah.
it as a yeah, at a
So like
head.
if you just look at a synopsis here, it like tracks with Mark. He introduces, this is like Luke has like nothing new.
Mm.
This is kind of
Yeah,
one of the like the
hot take.
weird, like
Yeah.
what was he doing?
Yeah.
He has a lot more about Jesus's birth.
Mhm.
Like we have the
That's new.
Magnificat,
Yeah, yeah. The Psalms.
Elizabeth, and like that's
Simeon. Yeah.
um pretty cool.
Mhm.
But then here, Mark 6, Jesus is rejected at Nazareth. Matthew and Mark put it at the same spot. That's why they're bolded here. Matthew later 13, Mark later in 6. And here you can see Luke tracks the whole way,
Mm.
except that spot is flipped
Yeah.
up.
And the Bible Project's video does a good job, I think, of emphasizing that in Luke's narrative of Jesus's ministry, this good news to the poor, Exodus,
Hmm.
release of the captives, those themes are prominent in how Jesus is portrayed as teaching and healing and moving. And all of that is prefigured or foretold in the Isaiah scroll. And then Jesus says that explicitly in his Nazareth sermon. So to me, that it is programmatic. It belongs early, at least in what Luke is doing. It makes sense to say that's the start of his ministry. That's
Yeah.
his coming out part. This is what we're doing.
Hmm. Yeah, so that seems to be intentional on
Mhm.
Luke's part, if it is that Luke is using Mark.
Yeah, should we talk about the synoptic problem?
Yeah. Um, yeah, let's talk about the synoptic problem. So um, you can click in the PowerPoint here, and I have a chat GPT giving you the pros and cons of all the major
Okay, nice.
theories here. But yeah, I put here the 4 main ones. There's the traditional, which is Matthew, Mark summarized Matthew, and then Luke used both of them.
Hmm.
Because this is all, like Luke says, I used earlier sources.
Right.
So
It makes you ask the question, which sources?
yeah, and it's like you could make an argument that, well, they're all just divinely inspired, and that's why it came out the same.
Right.
Where, like, I guess it's possible,
There's no reason to make that argument,
but
though.
Luke says he used sources.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So why not just
Trust
go with
Luke.
yeah. So that's why that's the synoptic problem.
Yeah.
Who used who? Because Luke says, hey, we're using each other.
Mhm.
Right. So the traditional Matthew, Mark summarized Matthew, and Luke used both of them. The the critique of that is that it seemed like Mark is shorter. Mark seems to be rougher Greek at times. And
In a lot of ways, Matthew reads like a polished version of Mark
yeah,
with added teaching and
yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
And so it's well, and things like people say like the Sermon on the Mount, Mark just, yeah, that's not relevant.
He cut it
You
out.
cut it
Right.
out.
Yeah.
Cut
That's
that,
hard
cut
to
it-
believe.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of like against the traditional, that it seems more likely that Mark is first. And that's kind of like all of the other, there's another Greisbach, which is flips in this scheme, Luke and Mark. But um, most people want to say Mark came first in some way today, most
Mhm.
scholars. And so the main one that I feel like we probably hear the most is the two source hypothesis, where you have Mark and then Luke and Matthew independently use Mark.
Mhm.
Okay, so Luke and Matthew don't know each other, but they both use Mark. And then, but then you have to explain, why is there so much overlap between Luke and Matthew apart from Mark?
Right. They didn't know each other. There's a lot of moments where they agree,
Right.
and they're not relying on Mark.
And they're not relying on Mark.
Yeah.
And so that's where this idea of Q, which in German is short for source, Quelle. And so basically, the where Luke and Matthew overlap are just like sayings and teachings. And so the theory is that Q is a collection of stories and sayings about Jesus that Luke and Matthew had a.
Which we don't have.
So okay,
Yeah.
and that's the weakness of the two source hypothesis is we don't have this document.
Mhm.
Maybe it's witnessed in the Gospel of Thomas at times, but that's about all we got.
Mhm.
The patristics never talk about it.
Right.
No one knows about Q.
Yeah, we kind of made it up.
We kind of made it up.
Yeah.
Um, some people, I forget if it's Papias or Irenaeus or some early or church father talks about Matthew wrote in Aramaic, and then that was translated into Greek. And most scholars think like Matthew is not a translation of Aramaic.
Hmm.
And so some people have pointed to that as Q.
An Aramaic version of Matthew as Q.
Yeah,
Oh.
something like that. But yeah, the weakness is like there just seems to be little first century evidence or first, second century evidence of this existence
The
of Q.
existence of Q, which would be pretty important.
Right.
Yeah.
For this
Yeah.
hypothesis. Or you can just say think of Q as like just oral tradition. There's just people know about Jesus' sayings, Matthew and Luke draw on
That's
that.
possible. Yeah.
So the problems with Q lead to the other two hypotheses. And so the fair hypothesis is probably the most popular alternative. And this is where Matthew uses Mark, but then forget Q, Luke uses both Mark and Matthew, and that would explain the overlap between them.
Or you can do the same the other way. I guess that's what the Luke and
Right.
Good.
Right. And so, yeah, there's different debates of like, and this is why people do the two source is because they want Luke and Matthew to be independent because there's at times where it seems like, oh, Matthew could be using Luke. And then there's other times where it seems, oh, Luke could be using Matthew.
Yeah.
And so it seems that there's enough difference, and you could argue either way that they want them independent. And then the fair and Luke and priority argue no, one is dependent on the other.
Interesting.
And I don't know all the arguments there, but
do you have a strong gut feeling or opinion?
I
feel like you probably lean tradition.
That's yes, or like I don't care.
Yeah.
Is one of the things, and part of this is it feels like they, like what I said, the argument against the traditional is why would Mark take out the Sermon on the Mount? Because maybe Mark is just writing something different. Like maybe his main goal isn't to just collect all the information about Jesus that he could and like patch them together at the source, but like Mark is actually trying to do something unique, you know?
Yeah, that's possible.
And so I just think there's a lot of confidence that scholars have of like Luke would never fight Matthew.
How
like
these first century editors
Yeah.
must have been working, or
we
what
know their
priorities were.
intentions and
Right, yeah.
motivations
Yeah, that's a good point.
of why they like dropped words and changed it. It's like, well, maybe they just didn't care, or like they're just doing
That
something
wasn't the
different.
point. Yeah.
And we just don't know.
Right.
That's the thing. We just can't tell their intentions. So that's what I think.
Yeah, I like it.
That's me not taking a position
Yeah.
on the synoptic problem.
My only take, I think, I don't have a problem with two source hypothesis as long as we're not like reifying Q as like a real thing. I think if it's like oral tradition that's passed around that most Christians knew, then sure. But that's not usually what scholars mean when they talk about Q. In fact, you can buy like Q. You can buy critical editions of Q.
And commentaries on it.
Commentaries on Q. That is insane.
And people start to go like source layers of Q.
Why? It's not, I mean, I haven't read that much about it, so maybe there's
we say this all with the caveat of neither of us are synoptic gospel scholars. But we find that a bit shaky.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to is the gospel. So there's this big debate in gospel scholarship of what is the genre of the gospels. Okay, is it historiography? Is it biography? Or are they something unique? Let's call them gospels. Okay.
I like that.
So those are kind of like the three main positions: biography, historiography, or unique. They're gospels.
Yeah.
And the argument that they're gospels, I think, is largely dependent on Mark 1:1, where it says the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so it seems like Mark is naming his work and calling it a gospel. But I think in Luke, we have, so you have Luke and then you have Acts, okay? Acts is not biography.
That's right, yeah, there's
no way you can argue Acts is biography.
Main character would be like the Holy Spirit. Maybe.
Yeah, right. And so people who argue that the Gospels are biography, which is Maybe the consensus,
Yeah, great.
or like,
Yeah.
Um, you have to then say the Gospel of Luke is a different genre than Acts,
Mhm.
but they're part of the same,
Volume 1, Volume 2, but different
but
genres.
different
Yeah.
genres, which is a bit,
Not a popular view.
um, well,
Well, yeah,
it is
yeah,
popular, but
yeah.
like,
It combines,
it's a
yeah.
bit strange. And so I kind of like the idea of historiography in this sense. And um, the prologue, I feel like helps give that away.
Mhm.
So this is a picture here that we have of Wright and Bird's New Testament and its World on pages 618 to 19, where they just quote other historians and explain what they're doing here. And so Polybius talks about, in my former book, I explained the causes of the Second War, and then goes on to talk about a second one that rings similar to the
Mhm.
first verse in Acts.
This Josephus one, I think it sounds so similar.
Yeah. So Josephus says, this is in his against Appian. He says, I suppose that my books of the antiquities of the Jews, most excellent
Epaphroditus.
Epaphroditus, so on, and then goes on. I therefore have thought myself under an obligation to write somewhat briefly about these subjects, and going on, and withal to instruct all those who are desirous of knowing the truth of what great antiquity we really are. As for the witnesses whom I shall produce for the proof of what I say, they, so and so on. So he's like talking to this most excellent Epaphroditus, um, talking about he's going to summarize this, and he's using eyewitnesses to
Right.
do it, eyewitness accounts.
So similar to what Luke said.
So similar
Yeah.
that it seems like Luke is viewing himself as doing the same thing as these other
Mhm.
historians around the same time.
You know, I think this is a good time to bring this up. I read one article that we can link to about, or where someone is saying that the purpose of Luke, and therefore maybe the genre of Luke, is supporting evidence in Paul's trial in Rome. And so, in that case, it sounds a lot like this against Apion. Like, I've been accused of things.
Mm,
Here are my eyewitnesses, and I put them in an orderly account for you to read so you can understand what I'm doing. And the idea was that Paul and Luke are together in Rome, Paul's on trial, and Luke, the historian, is putting together Paul's defense to support Paul
yeah,
in his trial. Interesting idea.
yeah. And so like we just read it there in Josephus, like his main work, Antiquities of the Jews, is he's trying to prove the antiquity of the Jews,
Right.
right? Like antiquity was such a value thing, and that seems to be what Luke is doing. And this is where like the Bible Project talks about, it's not only the long covenant story of God in Israel, it's also the story of God in the whole world.
Mhm.
So like where Matthew starts his genealogy with Abraham, goes down, Luke takes it all the way back to Adam.
Right. This is the story from the
Like
beginning of the world.
we're like more ancient than all y'all,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
We go back to Adam
Yeah.
and God,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
The Son
Yeah.
of God. And so it does seem like Luke is trying to give an apologetic. He's defending Christianity by showing that it's very old. This was the intention the whole time
Yeah.
of God. And that's how Luke ends. Or like you have the genealogy in chapter 3, where it takes the genealogy all the way back to God.
Mhm.
And then you have the ending of Luke with these appearances where Jesus says, all that was written in Moses, the Psalms, and the prophets is about me. Right? This intentional link of the antiquity of this all. Jesus is just carrying on the whole Old Testament
Yeah.
to its fulfillment. So, yeah. So that kind of brings us to here. What is the purpose of Luke down here? So, supposedly, Conzelman, in his book Die Mitte der Zeit, argued that Luke was giving an apologetic, but he was trying to comfort or like explain why Jesus hadn't returned yet.
That was a super popular idea in the 60s. This like delay of the parousia.
Yeah.
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 Christians, yeah. The hypothesis that first century, second century Christians were really troubled by the idea that the end times hadn't come yet.
Right.
Yeah.
And so this is like in the midst of time or middle of time.
Yeah.
And so basically that Luke is explaining, no, the end times was supposed to be later, but now there's this
in between
in
time.
between time that Jesus and the apostles sit in. So he puts Jesus in the middle of time, not at the end of time. It's kind of that's whole Luke's entire apologetic is to answer that question.
Yeah.
And that was like super popular.
Mm.
And all the commentaries that I've read, like modern commentaries, don't think that anymore.
And maybe like one small part of what Luke's trying to do.
Right, part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So most of like you see these other ones, like Noland argues that Luke's point is to show that the Gentiles have a place in God's history, which I think um, people argue that Luke is the only Gentile writer of the New Testament, and so he's writing to maybe Gentiles.
Again, I think that's definitely a part of what Luke's trying to do. Yeah.
I kind of like this. D. Moody Smith says maybe Luke was just trying to write scripture. Like, you have First Kings, and then we need to write Second Kings.
Yeah.
And he's just like, well, I'm going to write the next installment.
Someone's got to write it. I'm a historian.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Inspired by the Spirit, I'm writing the next, and that would be this idea of like him continuing the Old Testament narrative, being part of that.
And it works with the Luke Acts double volume thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. But people usually go, so like Bach here says it's to legitimize the new Christian movement in some way.
Yeah. That's where the Paul's legal defense idea fits in. My issue with that is, well, imagine you're Tacitus or you're some Roman official in charge of prosecuting Paul or just trying to understand the Christian movement, and you get Luke's gospel. Do you think like, oh, this is no problem? I think you're deeply unsettled, actually. Like, look how the people in power tend to respond to Jesus' message in Luke. They're not happy about it. There's a lot of like, woe to the rich in Luke. That's a quote from Jesus. So this like programmatic message of release and exodus, I don't think those are the kind of themes that people in power tend to just be chill about or to think, oh, it's fine. So it's hard for me to imagine Luke was written in order to placate really powerful people.
Yeah.
Like
it might have led more to Paul's execution.
Right. If I'm the Roman emperor and I read Luke, I think the Christians are trouble. Like this is not a chill movement. And look how they're spreading and turning the world upside down. That's how accents, right? That's a
good point.
I'm not sure I'm sold on those, but yeah. Oh, just on this point of Jesus as continuing the Old Testament, which I think is definitely fulfilling, is the word that Luke uses, at least at the beginning of the gospel. I don't know if he says were written about me in Luke 24. I'm not sure if he uses the word. We could check on that, but the gospel probably really leaned into this Jesus as the new Moses thing. And they did that in Matthew too, or Matthew as well. And I don't disagree with that. I think both of these gospel writers are doing something like that, presenting Jesus as the new Moses. But I think in both cases, that emphasis misses the point a little bit. So I won't rehash all of Matthew, but clearly in Matthew, you have Sermon on the Mount, feeding the 5,000, walking on water. These are moments that recapitulate Exodus, Deuteronomy, Torah, and Jesus is presented as Moses. But the Gospel Project, sorry, I keep saying that, don't I? The Bible Project. Yeah, Bible Project also highlights in Matthew this Emmanuel motif. So in my view, if you're going to argue that these narratives rehash Exodus, Deuteronomy, and you're going to say Jesus is God with us, then the best parallel is not Jesus equals Moses. It's Jesus equals Yahweh. And I think you can say something similar in Luke, and for all those same points. But I'll also say, in particular, in the Bible Project video, they talk about the Transfiguration. So you have Moses and Elijah on the mountain with Jesus. And they're talking about Jesus' exodus. And the takeaway point from their video is, so Jesus is the new Moses, leading an exodus, leading new Israel out of Egypt. And there's something to that. But I do think we're missing the point if we look at the Transfiguration and our takeaway is, oh, Jesus is a new Moses. I think closer to the point would be to say the experience that Peter and James and John are having on the mountain is the kind of experience Moses had on the mountain. Moses encountered Yahweh on the mountain, and these disciples are seeing Jesus transfigured on the mountain. So again, Jesus fills the role of Yahweh, not of Moses.
Mhm.
And it struck me that the Transfiguration may be the clearest depiction of Jesus's superhumanity, divinity in the Gospels. And I don't think the takeaway is therefore Jesus is Moses.
Well, Patrick Schreiner, in his book on the Transfiguration,
Okay.
just says both.
Sure, yeah, I think
Yeah.
it is both. But Moses is standing there.
Yeah,
You know, like
he's not Moses.
right. If you want to like plug people into the narrative and say this is that, I really think Peter and Moses might be a better
Mhm.
moment. They climb the
They're
mountain
both,
and they
yeah.
see the glory of
Yeah.
the God figure. It's Jesus is Yahweh in that. And therefore the Exodus he leads, he's not playing the role of Moses. Maybe he is playing Moses' role, but he's
the angel of the Lord.
yeah, he's leading and that's the kind of fire from heaven we get in Acts.
Yeah.
Like I think there's a better parallel you can draw.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that happened again in Matthew. We didn't draw that out in Matthew,
Yeah.
but and maybe the Bible Project's being somewhat conservative about this more theological reading, but I think it's native to Luke's thought. I think that's what Luke's doing.
It's pretty cool. The only other two things I have here is some people note the lack of cross atonement theology in Luke Acts. It focuses more on like the vindication of Jesus as the resurrected one.
Yeah.
Doesn't talk a lot about like dying for the forgiveness of sins or things like that. It does occasionally in like the Last Supper account. And then there's one of, I think, Paul's speeches. He brings it up of justification, forgiveness of sins. But it's not as much of an emphasis, which is just kind of interesting. And I don't really know why or why not.
Yeah, it's sometimes those themes are the theme of atonement and the theme of like social justice and good news to the poor are pitted against each other. They shouldn't be. They're obviously both there in Luke, and throughout the gospel. But it does seem like Luke has a particular emphasis, maybe because he's a doctor or whatever, but he has a particular emphasis on the poor and forgotten by society, saying this is good news for you.
Yeah.
Social implications of justification and reconciliation to God.
Yeah. And then the last thing I have here is when Jesus is on the cross and says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Unbelievable moment.
There's a textual variant there.
Yeah.
And some translations put it in brackets, similar to like the ending of Mark or
John 8.
Yeah. And this is I actually like I have a harder time with this one than the ending of Mark or because this is just like it's such an epic moment.
Yeah.
Right. And this is another one of people can argue both ways of like why would a scribe insert the sin or take it out? You know, he would take it out because Jesus can't be forgiving these Romans.
It's unfathomable. Yeah.
It just doesn't make sense. And then inserting it in, you could argue. So the thing is, Stephen quotes this when he dies, right? Father, forgive them. They don't know what they do. And so could it be like Stephen, or here's the like it would be weird for Stephen to quote that and not think he's imitating Jesus' death. Like Stephen is dying like Christ. He's the first martyr, and there's like intentional links between Christ and Stephen. So why would Stephen say that if it's not linked to anything?
Right.
But maybe that's the logic why scribes added it in.
Added it to Jesus.
Yeah. Because Jesus surely said this. But it's another one of those, it's like, it's true, whether or not it's in or out. Stephen says it.
Right.
So if it's true there, then it's a true fact, but it is a variant that some people will utilize to like deconstruct Jesus. Or
it's interesting because I don't even think, even if it's not there, it's not like Jesus is not forgiving in the Gospel of Luke.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't take away much. It takes away something awesome, which is a bummer. But I haven't seen it published where it's in brackets.
Oh,
they're that uncertain. Maybe I just haven't noticed.
In the I don't know, the NA28, I don't know if it has it. I think it's in brackets in the NA28. And it might be in brackets like the NRSV, maybe the NIV. I forget. But
dang.
Yeah. So it's kind of a downer. How do we end in a
Yeah.
Your comments about Jesus standing in for Yahweh in the theophanies, and
Yeah.
that should have been our
Yeah, we should
epic
have
final
done that.
moment.
Yeah,
But
it's good stuff.
it
We'll
is
see
good
that more in
stuff.
John.
Yeah.
Maybe the last point about, Christology, synoptic Christology versus John
Yeah.
Christology. The tradition has been to say that John's later, John's more Christologically developed. And so, yeah, you have quotes like, I and the Father are one. Jesus is pretty obviously God is the Word became flesh.
Yeah.
And the argument has been that high Christology is not in the synoptics.
Right.
In my view, like I was just demonstrating, it's pretty clear that what John says, the synoptics show, or maybe what John tells, the synoptics show. So if you read between the lines, if you like read narratologically, it's pretty clear to me, I think, that the synoptic authors are presenting Jesus as divine, whether or not they have these one-off quotes, I am the resurrection of the life and the life, I am the Father are one.
Yeah.
Jesus functions in the narrative as Yahweh.
So you're an early high Christology guy?
I'm an early high Christology in the Gospels guy. Actually, I'm not completely alone in that. Obviously, the early church agrees with me, but even in modern scholarship, there's a growing move to say high Christology happened earlier, meaning earlier than John and earlier than the writing of the Synoptics. So if you read Larry Hurtado or Matthew Bates, some of their work shows a really early high Christology in Paul. Some of his letters were written contemporaneous with these or before these. If Luke was written in 80, then we have evidence that Paul was thinking of Jesus as divine before that. And Luke's his companion.
Yeah.
So there's reason to say that Luke thought of Jesus as divine. For some reason, that hasn't dripped into synoptic scholarship much, which is interesting. Although there's one recent book on historical Jesus by Brendan Petrie, I think, on early high Christology and the synoptics mainly. Early high Christology and the historic, and well, we'll get to that, but it's like divine Christology and historical Jesus, something like that. And he's making this connection that even if you just read the synoptics on their own terms, don't import John, don't import later Christologies, it's clear that Jesus thinks of himself as divine, which is, I think, a really interesting argument. Yeah.
Dale Allison,
yeah,
who's, well-respected,
yeah.
top of the field historical Jesus, makes the argument in his chapter on Christology that Jesus thought of himself as more than a prophet.
Mm-hmm. I think the actual language is Jesus thought of himself as the king of the kingdom of God, which is completely unobjectionable, I think. Like, he's announcing the kingdom of God is at hand. Here I am. My kingdom's not of this world. That's John. But clearly the way that Matthew, Mark, and Luke present Jesus, he thinks of himself as the king of this kingdom.
Yeah, but I think Dale Allison went even further of he thinks he's
God.
I don't know about God, but something really high that to the extent that historical Jesus people just say somebody as logical as Jesus can't think that about himself. And Dale Allison gives historical examples of really good academic people who thought of themselves as the Messiah or God. And so it's this happens, it does happen sometimes. So maybe Jesus was crazy, but that doesn't mean he couldn't have said all these cool things.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Dale.
Yeah.
Well, we'll get to John.
All right. Yeah, thanks for tuning in, and see you next time.